The following program is a production of Truth for the World.
Ye servants of God, your Master proclaim, and publish abroad His wonderful name, the name all victorious of Jesus extol. His kingdom is glorious, He rules over all.
We are looking at the Synoptics, and in our first lesson we're going to try to talk about prophecy and providence. But as far as introduction goes, to make sure that we're all on the same page, what we're really, I hope to accomplish through these series of lessons, you might just call it, if you don't want to call it Synoptics, call it Lessons from the Life of Christ. Now, some study of the Synoptics usually will include the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Sometimes they're studied together as one because they're similar in their descriptions of the life of Christ. And that's mainly what we'll be focusing on. Most of the time we'll be in the book of Matthew, but on occasion we may be in Mark or Luke. And in this lesson we want to set the stage and look at what came before the Christ. We're going back into prophecy and providence. So let's first start with prophecy. When we talk about the word Christ, we mean the anointed one. To anoint means to confer an office on someone. In the Old Testament, there is pointing forward to someone who's coming. And prophecy in the Old Testament points time and time again to that person who's coming, someone who will fulfill God's chosen plan of salvation. And prophecy tells us that He's coming and He's going to be anointed with the three divine offices. Prophet, He will be a prophet. Priest, He will be a priest. And king. And in the Old Testament, we may find somebody who is one of these things, a prophet, or one of these other things, a king, but this person is going to be all three: prophet, priest, and king. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, we see one of the things prophesied for His goals or His plan is to crush Satan, to deliver a crushing blow to Satan. All the way back in the Garden of Eden, right in the very beginning, the prophecy started talking about the Christ, the one who would be coming. God says, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman," referring to Satan, "and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." God Himself makes this first prophecy about the Christ. And interestingly enough, He says, it will deliver a crushing blow to Satan, and he will come from the seed of a woman. This prophecy is interesting because usually in Old Testament genealogy, people are described as coming from the seed of man or from the lineage of men. But this prophecy says the Christ will come from the seed of a woman. Similarly to that, in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, the prophecy says that the Christ would be born of a virgin. And if you think about it, that makes sense along with the prophecy in Genesis 3. If He's going to come from the seed of a woman without the aid of a man, then He would come from a virgin. And in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14 we read, "Therefore the Lord Himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call His name Emmanuel." And we know that the word Emmanuel means God with us. God will be living with us and dwelling with us. And that will be the Christ. Also part of His duties and what He will accomplish is to sacrifice Himself for our sins. This is prophesied even as far back as Isaiah 53, to sacrifice Himself for our sins. Notice Isaiah chapter 53. We're going to read verses 4 through 6. "Surely He hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem Him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But He was wounded for our transgressions." Do you see that? He will suffer not because of something he did, but because of our sin. He was bruised for our iniquities. Iniquities is another word for sin or lawlessness. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. How will we obtain peace between God and man? Through him. With his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. Jesus will bear the punishment of the entire world's sin. Well, that's all in prophecy. We knew someone was coming, and you can find prophecy after prophecy about this Christ that's going to come in the Old Testament. We get up to the point of Malachi, though, and we find some interesting history, and part of that I want to look at through the eyes of providence. It's hard oftentimes to point to something and say, that's God's providence. God is working things out. But some things seem, at least to me, so abundantly clear that God was working things out the way he wanted that it's hard not to call it providence, at least for me. But God, before Christ even came, was working through his providence to prepare the world for the preaching of Jesus and the spread of the gospel. In Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, we read that Jesus came when the time was right. If you're like me, you've wondered, why didn't Jesus come like in the 20th century, or why didn't he come at other times? The answer was it was the right time. It was the right time for Jesus to come. The situation was right. The circumstances were correct. And God, I believe, made it that way through his providence. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 says, when the fullness of the time was come, when the time was full, when it was full and ready, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, there's that reference to the virgin birth again, made under the law. Well, Daniel prophesied all the way back in the book of Daniel about 4 kingdoms that would exist. You may remember this. And God's kingdom would be established during the time of the 4th kingdom. The Christ was going to come during the time of the 4th kingdom. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 31. You remember that it's really the king who had this vision or dream, right? And Daniel is merely interpreting what that vision meant through the help of God. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 through 45, Daniel says, Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold. Notice the distinctions in here. There's one distinction. The head was gold. His breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. There's really 4 distinctions going on there. The different metals that are being mentioned, and the different parts of the body, going from head all the way down to the feet. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. Here comes what that image means. Daniel's going to explain to the king, here's what the image means. You're a king of kings. The God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Your kingdom is so great, you are the head of gold. That head of gold, king, that represents your kingdom, the Babylonian kingdom. And after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee, and another 3rd kingdom of brass. So the head of gold is your kingdom, then there's going to be another kingdom And after that, a third kingdom of brass. And that kingdom, the third kingdom, shall bear rule over all the earth. That's interesting. Take note of that and remember that. And then the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, forasmuch as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. As iron that breaketh all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, forasmuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And here it is, in that fourth kingdom, in the time of the fourth kingdom, in the days of these kings, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. God is going to set up his kingdom, and that kingdom shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that means it's made by God, right? And it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Now keep in mind, this prophecy happened hundreds and hundreds of years before the events took place. During that time where Daniel prophesied, he was in the Babylonian kingdom. That's the first one. There's 4 kingdoms we're talking about. The Babylonian kingdom was the first one. Daniel prophesied, after you there will be another kingdom that will be inferior. Well, we know through history that the next empire to come was called the Medo-Persian Empire. Or some just may refer to it as the Persian Empire, but Medo-Persian Empire. And that empire was not as great as the Babylonian one, but it was the next one that came along. History tells us the next one would be the Greek Empire. And you remember the prophecy, the third kingdom would bear rule over all the earth, Daniel says? Well, the Greek Empire led by Alexander the Great conquered the world. It is said that Alexander cried after his last conquest because there were no more places left to conquer. And then the fourth kingdom that Daniel mentions is, of course, the Roman Empire, which succeeded the Greek Empire. Now, the Roman Empire was divided. They would conquer an area, but they would allow things from the past to remain, provided they did not cause trouble for the empire. They didn't exactly mix and meld together, and everyone all became Romans per se. The Romans were still Romans, but the Jews were still Jews, and et cetera, et cetera. They didn't mix, just as Daniel said, the iron, you can't mix iron with clay. They're not going to blend together. And it's during that time that Daniel said God would set up his kingdom, and that kingdom would last forever. Looking down through these lists of kingdoms, the Babylonian Empire had taken Jews into captivity, you remember, including Daniel. And after that came the Medo-Persian Empire. These Persians were under a man named Cyrus who conquered the Babylonians. So at this point, we're talking about 539 BC, before the New Testament. 539 years or so before the New Testament. Cyrus appointed a man named Darius, a Mede, as a vassal king of the region. This is one reason, it's the reason it's called the Medo-Persian Empire. He let the Medes, you stay rule over here, you just got to be loyal to me, basically. So there's the Medes over here and the Persians over here. And that region included Palestine and Babylon. And so sometimes we refer to that kingdom as the Medo-Persian Empire. Isaiah prophesied even about Cyrus, that he was to come. In Isaiah chapter 44, looking at verses 28 through chapter 45, verse 1, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. Isaiah not only prophesies about the temple being rebuilt, but talks about the man who would allow it to happen and calls him by name, Cyrus. And if we look in the book of Nehemiah, we can see that Nehemiah served Cyrus, and Cyrus allowed him to go back and rebuild their temple. So about the time we reach the Old Testament, if we go to what we have about the end of Malachi, we're still under the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persian dominance is in effect at the end of the Old Testament. And in the way we have the books organized, the very last verses of the Old Testament, Malachi, prophesies about someone who would come named Elijah. Interesting, because there was already an Elijah earlier in the Old Testament, and he's dead now. But Malachi says somebody is going to come in the future, and he's going to be called an Elijah too. Malachi 4, 5 through 6 says, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. So we're kind of left hanging. It's almost like to be continued. There's going to be an Elijah one day to come, but now you just have to wait. And in between Malachi and the book of Matthew, we have what we call the 400 years of silence, where there's no prophecy and there's no revelations and things. But history continues. The Greek Empire succeeds the Medo-Persian Empire. Philip of Macedon succeeded in uniting the Greek city-states under one rule. You may have heard of a place called Philippi, or maybe a book in the New Testament called Philippians to the people. Well, that's named after Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon united the Greek city-states, and his son was Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is known in history for conquering the known world. So if you can imagine the Greeks going across the known world and spreading their influence wherever they went. That influence is called Hellenization, spreading of the Greek influence, the Greek culture, the Greek language. And so by conquering the known world, the Greek influence was spread all over. Along those lines, from about 300 BC, we've gone about 100 years past Malachi. From about 300 BC all the way to AD 300 years approximately past the time of Christ, Greek was the common tongue of the Mediterranean world because of that influence. When the apostles or other people spoke Greek to teach the gospel, they could probably find people to understand them wherever they went. When it was time for the gospel to be spread around the world, that common language was all around the world. Not only that, but the Old Testament scriptures were translated into Greek, into something known as the Septuagint or the LXX. If you know your Roman numerals, LXX means 70, and it's named that because there were 70 scholars that supposedly worked on the translation. But if Greek is the common tongue, you look at the Old Testament and say, well, that's in Hebrew. But during this time, the Hebrew was translated into Greek so that even people all around the world could understand the Old Testament prophecies that someone is coming and the Christ is coming. It makes you wonder, maybe that's what Jesus is talking about to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Art thou a ruler of Israel and you don't know these things? If you look in the Greek, the way he words that, it's almost a declarative statement more than a question. Do you not know these things? You should know this, and people would know this. This is the common language, and now the Old Testament is available to people in the common language of Greek. Antiochus Epiphanes, a Greek king, came along and did something very interesting. He demanded that shrines to Greek deities be built and sacrifices of swine be offered. Now imagine how the Jews felt about that. Unclean animals offered to Greek deities. Well, some Jews rebelled and were led by a man named Judas Maccabeus. And fighting between the Jews and the Greeks continued until Judas's successors finally obtained a treaty with Rome in 139 BC. And this established a new ruling dynasty in Palestine. Priests known as Hasmoneans became powerful and wealthy. Before we enter into the New Testament, we learn that these priests became powerful and wealthy. So sometimes if we look in the New Testament, such as Matthew 26:59, and see references to things like chief priests and their power and their wealth, this may be because they became the Hasmonean priests after this treaty with Rome. And when Jesus comes along threatening their authority and threatening their power and threatening their money, they don't like it. The Jewish people really may have gravitated in this time period toward one of three groups. The Maccabeans, who had rebelled, became the Hasmonean high priests. Now remember, the Greeks, as they conquer the known world, are spreading their Greek culture. Some people resisted that Greek culture and didn't want to participate in it. We might call these the Hasidim, who'd resisted Greek culture, and those people really may have become the Pharisees. You know the groups called the Pharisees in the New Testament. They resisted this Greek culture, didn't like it, didn't appreciate it. However, there were other people who did accept some of Greek culture and accepted some of it. Those were the Hellenists, and they thought highly of it. And those Jews really may have become the Sadducees. The influence of Greek culture and Greek conquering the world caused some division even among the Jews, because they were either accepting of Jewish or Greek culture or resistant against it. And so now you can kind of perhaps start to see where these two factions of Jews started to come from, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that will enter into the picture in the New Testament times. Last but not least comes the fourth empire that Daniel prophesied about, the Roman Empire. The rule of Palestine was entrusted to Antipater, who was an Idumean, a descendant of Esau. And you can imagine the Jews weren't totally happy about that either. There was no popular support for him from the Jews, and he began what we call the Herodian dynasty, the people called Herod throughout the history there. Herod the Great came after Antipater and ruled as king of the Jews from about 37 BC to about 4 BC. So he was probably in charge about the time of the birth of Christ. Herod the Great. This was a family full of suspicion and cruelty and trickery and conniving and various other things. He was suspicious and cruel, killed his own mother, killed his wife, and massacred male infants. You remember Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16? Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. When it came to power, they would let nothing stop them from holding on to it, including murdering their own family. After Herod the Great died, around 4 BC, Palestine was divided between his 3 sons after his death. One was named Philip, one was Antipas, and one was Archelaus. Well, not only did the Jews react poorly to some of the people put in charge, but the Jews reacted so violently to Archelaus that Rome took him out of power. There was so much of a stir caused up by him that Rome just took him out. And instead, they put his territory, which consisted of Judea and Samaria, under a series of procurators, or Roman governors. Interestingly, one of those Roman governors was named Pilate. We would run into him later on in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 27, specifically, when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And when they bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor that was in charge. So as we set the stage, we can see in some ways God's providence, getting things ready for the arrival of the Christ. And we set the stage of what the world was like before we start reading through the Synoptics in the New Testament. Life under the Roman Empire, the world was basically at peace at the coming of the Messiah. Jesus did not have to come during a time of massive warfare and was probably able to travel and move around without too much problem, as were his disciples able to move around and travel without too much problem. Greek was still a common language. So no matter where you went, if you could speak Greek or you could pull out the Old Testament scriptures that were translated in Greek, you could teach people, and there were people that were able to hear you and understand. There was widespread poverty. Sometimes, for whatever reason, people that are poor seem to respond more to the gospel. Perhaps it's because they're in so much need and not trusting in themselves. Riches make us trust in ourselves, don't we? We don't need anybody else, and we don't need God because I'm rich. Well, you may fool yourself in thinking that way and be less receptive to the gospel. But with widespread poverty, there were probably a lot of people who would say, I'm interested in something that'll help me. Slavery was common in the empire, except in Palestine. And not only was slavery common, polytheism, or the belief in multiple gods. That was the rule among citizens in the empire, except in Palestine. Part of what we read in latter parts of the New Testament, including things like Revelation or persecutions going on, was related to this Roman polytheism. If you were accused of Christianity in the early days of Christianity, the way you could escape death was sacrifice to the Roman gods and pray to them. And there was low morality. Some of the horrendous morality you want to read about in history happened during the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, part of what they did is being mimicked in America today. And you know the old saying, all roads lead to Rome. That's because the Romans built a lot of roads. And those roads made travel a whole lot easier. And so when it came time to disperse the gospel and to travel and to take the message, as we read about in Acts, they could do so a whole lot easier. All these things wouldn't have come together, though, perhaps without the providence of God making things ready. It was the right time, as Galatians 4:4 says. When the fullness of time was come, that's when God sent His Son. People were ready for the message. It was easy to travel. It was easy to teach because of the language. And the time was right.
If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America. Or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org.